Hi there, friend and fellow traveler on the road of life. This is Pastor Roger Morton with a brief insight, of course, from the Bible to enrich and encourage your day. My topic today is God's gift of love. One gift of love which God gave us was a weekly day of rest and worship, the Sabbath. It was instituted at creation, Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3, and it was reaffirmed within the Ten Commandments when God himself said, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy," Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. Now, when Christ was on earth, he loved the Sabbath, and he actively participated in its observance, Luke 4, verses 14 to 20. He claimed, in fact, to be the very Lord of the Sabbath, Matthew 12, verse 8. Without a doubt, it is the Lord's Day. I would suggest that you look up each of these texts that I've mentioned in your own Bible to verify what I've just said as true. Just check it out. But how can you and I know today when God's holy Sabbath is? True, it is a memorial of creation, but we weren't there. So we couldn't keep track of the Sabbath as this has come down every seventh day since. Nor are there calendars or any documents coming down to us from creation week. Yes, only God could keep track of his holy day. Isn't that true? But fortunately, in historic times from which we do have documents, God clearly identified which day of the week was his holy day. Do you remember how following Israel's exodus from Egypt, God miraculously provided food? For 5 days, a regular amount of manna was given each morning. But on the sixth day, a double amount was given. Yet on the seventh day, none was on the ground because it was the Sabbath. God himself said so. You can read this story in Exodus chapter 16, verses 14 to 30. Now, a few weeks later, after this experience, when God said, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy," there was no doubt in anyone's mind which day of the week he was talking about. For 40 years, manna came, and each week of those years, God unmistakably identified which day of the week was the Sabbath. Now, down through the centuries following, Israel kept careful track of the Sabbath. And when Christ came to earth, he lived a life free of all sin, according to 1 Peter 2, verse 22. And sin is defined as the breaking of God's law, 1 John 3, verse 4. And that law required the careful observance of the Sabbath. Therefore we know that the Sabbath which Christ faithfully kept, the same Sabbath that the Jews were keeping, was the very multiple of 7 coming down to him from creation. But of course the question is, what about today? Can we trust our calendar to identify the true seventh-day Sabbath? Such a calendar was adopted throughout the Roman Empire in 45 BC under Julius Caesar and became known as the Julian calendar. Early Christians used this calendar to locate festivals such as Easter and Christmas. But in the 14th century, it was discovered that the solar year was not exactly 365 1/4 days long, and it was determined that every 400 years, 3 leap years should have been dropped to keep the calendar years and the solar years in agreement. This meant that 10 too many leap years had been observed since Caesar. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII decreed that the day following Thursday, October 4 of that year, should be Friday, October 15. Thus the Sabbath of the old calendar would be followed 7 days later by the Sabbath of the new calendar. And this is the calendar which we use today. The Bible states that following his crucifixion on Good Friday, Christ rested in the tomb on the Sabbath of the commandment, and then was resurrected on the first day of the week, that is Easter Sunday. Luke 23, verse 52, through chapter 24, verse 1. Am I correct? So what day on our calendar comes between Friday and Sunday? Why, Saturday, of course, identified in many Latin-based calendars as Sabado, the Holy Sabbath. Although surprising to many Christians, it is fact. Now, the Jews never adopted the Roman calendar, at least for determining their religious sacred festival days, and they also have kept careful track of the Sabbath through the centuries. So today, when do they observe the Sabbath of the fourth commandment, the Sabbath of creation? Of course, it's Saturday. So we have two major religious groups having two separate calendars, and yet both agreeing that the seventh-day Sabbath is clearly shown to be Saturday of each week. But there raises the question, well, why have Christians always worshipped on Sunday? The truth is that they haven't. Historic records show that Sunday was first observed by Christians about the year 134 AD in Rome and Alexandria during a Jewish revolt led by Bar Kokhba. This was to separate themselves from the rebels and avoid persecution. But Socrates, a church historian living 300 years later, said, for almost all the Christian churches throughout the world celebrate on the Sabbath of every week, yet the Christians at Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, refused to do so. And historic documents show that the Coptic Christians in Ethiopia, as well as the St. Thomas Christians in India, were still observing Saturday as the Sabbath in the 11th century. Now, the Waldensian Christians in northern Italy and the Celtic Christians in Spain, France, and England and Ireland were keeping Saturday sacred in the 16th century, according to historic documents. Few realize that the famous St. Patrick of Ireland was a Saturday-worshipping Celtic Christian. Interesting, don't you think? After Christ's second advent, when he returns to take those loyal to him to heaven, to be with him for eternity, we are told that from one Sabbath to another, all will come and worship before me, says the Lord, Isaiah 66, verse 23. Yes, the weekly day of rest and worship will remain. God said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And yet most of the world has forgotten. But not all. Today, more than 21 million Seventh-day Adventist Christians throughout the world worshiped on Saturday, not in order to be saved, but rather because they wish to follow Christ's example and honor his holy day. Won't you join us? Obedience to a loving sovereign only makes sense because it would be an evidence of trust and reciprocated love. Christ was not being overly authoritative when he said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." So I ask the question, do you love him? This is Pastor Roger Morton for WRGE.